Welcome to the Stoned Heen View, a podcast series which interviews a range of sport club representatives and leading professional sport club personnel during the COVID-19 period. We find out what these people are doing during the current health crisis, with some of our most popular sports seasons postponed. I'm Mark Heenan, and today I'm going to speak to a special guest. We've had some bigger guests on this program. We've had, Liz Ellis when it comes to, Australian netball, Tegan Phillip, a couple of AFL stars in there like Gary Hocking and, Michael Bowle. We've even had an international bowls rep, that won a bronze medal at the Commonwealth Games in London in Matt Flapper. But this one almost tops the cake. I mean, we're on to our penultimate episode for the period of Series 3, which is episode 62. And today I'm going to speak to a three-time Olympian and a three-time Commonwealth gold medalist. And I've got to say, I didn't have to contact her management about this because she is a bit of a friend and someone that I've had a chat to a little bit. She's going to be an expert athletics commentator for the Channel 7 network for the 2021 Toyko Olympics at next month's game. So looking forward to it. And her name's Tamsyn Manou. And Tamsyn, it's great to have you on the Stoned Heen View podcast for episode 62. Thank you for your time.
Oh, what a welcome. I'm not quite sure about being top of that list. That list was pretty impressive. I mean, you've got Buddha Hocking in there, was there? And Lizzie Legs Ellis. So it's a pretty good list.
Well, you've the three-time Olympian, Tamsyn. So I guess in some ways we wanted to talk a bit about the Olympics. Obviously, last year when we started the podcast, there was a sporting flavour around that. And I guess it's from all walks of life, whether people are volunteers or people that are athletes or people that are, working in commentary. And you fit a few of those hats at the moment. And we'll get on to your work experience, Dave, at the Herald Sun back in the day, because I used to work there as well. But that was a funny one. But I guess in some ways, Olympics coming up next month, it's going to have a different look to it. Should the Olympics be going ahead in COVID? And I guess they've been put off for 12 months. I mean, what are your thoughts about that and what's happening there?
Look, I know that there's a lot of people that have an opinion on this one. Being somebody who has spent a lot of time trying to represent their country and do something that, comes every 4 years, I would feel incredibly sad for the athletes if they didn't get their opportunity. I think that at some point we need the world to open up and keep moving forward. It's been a really tough way to live, especially if you're from Melbourne. The way that we've handled COVID crisis has been different to the rest of the world. And speaking to some of the international athletes who are just getting on planes and traveling around, it seems like they really are from a different world, the way that they're handling COVID compared to us. And I'm a big believer that I think the Olympics needs to go ahead. I think as long as you put some safety measures in, I think that it's something that people will really gravitate towards and watch, and they'll get a lot out of it, a lot of positive vibes. And I think that our athletes need it just for their mental psyche and just for their, at the end of the day, they're always going to remember the one that they missed if they don't get to go. And the fact that they are getting to go is a big deal for them.
Now, it's very interesting because recently, I know that you were covering the Australian track and field athletics championships, but what I found interesting was, and I know you're not a swimming commentator in that sense, but swimming and athletics are two of the biggest sports at the Olympics. And I'm not saying Channel 7 should have taken it on, and we realise that you're employed by Channel 7, but I found it a little bit interesting that I would think now you want to promote, things that are coming up to Commonwealth Games. We're 5-6 weeks out. Commonwealth Games starts in July. We're a little bit over a month away. I'm a little bit surprised.
Close enough.
Yeah, close enough. I'm a little bit surprised that the Amazon Prime medium and, great documentaries, AFL, cricket, love those documentaries they've done.
Awesome.
Is that they're doing the swimming championships, the Australian swimming championships. And I find that really interesting because I would have thought that a free-to-air network would take that on the benefit of fact of trying to promote these athletes in the lead up to the games. These swimmers, I know, as I said, athletics is your main forte in that sense, but just trying to promote some good coverage. I would have thought that would be open to the free-to-air networks. And I know you track and field championships. Were you a little bit surprised by that? And what was it like sort of covering the track and field championships in the lead up to the Olympic Games?
Yeah, it's definitely different to back leading into 2000 Olympics, where I call it the Freeman effect, where a lot of the networks were desperate and the media outlets were desperate to get hold of, anything that Kathy Freeman was involved in. And these days we're just looking and crying out for our stars to be there and for the media and the TV TV companies to be at. Can you hear my son? He's like banging on the door. Sorry about that. Hopefully my husband will rescue him.
Well, I've got a nephew called Oliver as well, so he's not banging on my door.
No, he's been taken away, but he'll be desperate to get in here and get in on the action. But no, it's one of those things where it's a shame that it's not like it used to be and it's not on free to air and live. But having said that, there's a new way of the world, and that's called the internet, and there's live streaming. And so track and field's gone down that path. And I guess the hardcore fans know to log in and to watch track and field these days. You can watch most of the meets live streamed. It's just trying to get that out to the masses so they know when it's on. I guess for the average person, they want to press the remote and see it on their TV very easily. But with the smart TVs, you can actually find track and field, and it was on 7plus, the national champs. Working on it, it was different, these championships. I think the athletes, you could really sense a different sort of vibe about them. Usually the nerves are so big before an Olympic trials, but there was kind of this little bit of relief that they were finally towing the line and getting out there to compete and try out to make these teams. I think they'd waited a long time to have a go. And the fact that the Olympic trials were actually going ahead, I feel like a lot of them were just relieved that they were going to have their opportunity to compete and make that team.
Now, you're based in Melbourne, and obviously you've moved back from Queensland, but I actually thought to myself, until you spoke off air about, moving back prior to COVID, but I wasn't sure, because I know that obviously broadcasting from the Channel 7 perspective, we had a guy called Ian Cohen on this podcast going back, and he was talking about the Commonwealth Games that him and Peter Donegan and Dave Colbert were doing around the London Olympics, and he saw the sign of that. And this was obviously well before COVID, in the sense that they were set up in Melbourne, and they'd have a studio, and they were doing a lot of these not just running events, but they were doing some of those big events. How's this going to look for you? Because you're not that far from home. You won't be going to China, or you won't be going to Japan, I should say, and you won't be leaving your kids behind. So I guess in some ways, take us into that sort of situation regarding broadcasting. I think one of the good analogies here, and you can relate to this because your husband's a former cricketer, is that during the Big Bash, they had a setup with the studio with Channel 7, and they were doing the games from the studio. Is it going to be similar in that sense with what Channel 7 are doing with the broadcasting with the 2021 Tokyo Olympics?
It will be. From what I've gathered, because of the way that Australia's handling COVID, where they lock states down, I think they've got so many contingency plans in place that we're not exactly sure which plan is going to be the one that we go for at the moment. I guess in the perfect world, we would be going over there. We're not. So the second plan is that we'll do it out of the Docklands. I'm working alongside the great man, Bruce McAvaney. So the best thing that could happen is that he and I are at least in the same studio calling off the same screen, which will make it a lot easier. Worst case scenario is he is in another state and we're both looking at the same feed but calling in separate studios, which will make it very difficult. But they do it with the football, and it is the way of the world this at the moment, and you kind of have to adapt and be able to do that. If we are in the same studio, we've done it before, because like Commonwealth Games, Olympics, we call the marathon in the studio and the race walking. And so we've done that sort of stuff before. I think the difficulty, the thing that makes me nervous, it will be the events like the 5,000 meters, the 3K steeple, and the 10,000 meters on the track. You'll need to make sure you kind of have a wide angle camera so that you can see where the Australian is, because the Australian might not be winning. There might be a fall. There might be something happen in the race that isn't on the main pack. And so you need to be able to see the whole field and the whole stadium, so that while Bruce is calling the front action, I can still see what's going on behind. There's things that I've never done before in terms of that, not being at the main stadium, that will be difficult. But, you just soldier on and you do what you can with what you've got, and you do as well as you can. And that's where research comes into it. You make sure you know what sort of runners, how they run their races, and you've got some little interesting life stories to tell about them, and hopefully everything turns out okay. But, when you're sitting next to Bruce, you know that he'll always have an answer and he'll always be able to guide us through whatever happens.
Yeah, I looked at some of the names that are part of that 7 stable for the, I suppose, the Olympics, particularly if we look at athletics, and Dave Colbert, and, like Jason Richardson, obviously a Stall gift winner. And, there's some big names in there. The school that I used to go to, Mark Beretta, he was a former St. Joseph's College student, being based in Sydney, Andy Marr and Lisa Stalaker, and obviously some of the other Olympians that are in there that have competed, Matt Shervington, and obviously Hamish McLaughlin's going to head up the team as well. I mean, take us into that. When we last year, in the lead up to what we thought would have been, last year's games, we had Tiffany Cherry on, and I spoke about, working with Bruce, and obviously, she was a training partner alongside Kathy Freeman. I watched some footage last night, Tams, and we'll talk about this a little bit later during the podcast about the relay team that you're involved with, the 4x100. But I found it interesting that the two commentators that commentated that were probably two of your biggest influences, if I say so, in Bruce McAvaney, probably from a working perspective with commentary, and then Sebastian Coe. I mean, how have you interacted with those two people during COVID? And I guess, you haven't seen them in the flesh like you would normally do. And what have those two people meant to you in your life?
Really tough not being able to see people that you care about. For me, Seb's like family. When I was an athlete, I stayed at his house, and his kids, when I first met them, they were all under the age of 10, his 4 kids, and I've watched them grow up. That's where FaceTime and speaking on the phones come in really handy. I think I was on a walk the other morning last week, and I was on the phone to Seb for about half an hour just chatting athletics. He was actually in Florence getting ready to watch the Golden Gala that had been moved to Florence for this year. So you can still stay in touch, which is great, but it is hard not being able to see them. Seb's been so instrumental in my track and field career. He's also been a great help in terms of navigating when you retire. Bruce McAvaney, well, when I got picked to sit next to him for Rio Olympics to work alongside him, it was a bit of a bucket list moment, And I think to have a mentor like him to learn from, to transition from the track into the commentary side of things and the media side of things, the stuff that he's taught me has been invaluable. And I'm very, very fortunate to be able to call him and his family also friends. So I do miss them. I miss them a lot. Hence, I'm really hoping that Bruce and I get to be in the same studio, because his daughter and his wife will be there as well. And I know his son works in the media as well. So I kind of like the friendships that you make. I think that for me is my favorite part of being a track and field athlete, and then having transitioned to this side of the fence. So being not able to see them has been really tough. Like most people in this world, I think it's that human connection, that genuine face-to-face interaction has been the thing that we've missed a lot. And that's one of those things that I've missed. Coming forward for the Olympic Games, I think that we're going to miss being there, because I think in Rio and at the Gold Coast, the thing that you really love and the thing you feed off is the crowd's support, and just watching it and seeing it. The atmosphere really lifts you. That's going to be something that's going to be one thing that I'm going to have to work on, and make sure that I still bring the energy without the crowd having to feed off.
Is that something that you've missed during, I suppose, COVID, is the travel aspect in a lot of ways? I mean, obviously, can you take us into some of the, not so much just work trips that you've done? I mean, obviously, you would have gone into state for the track and field championships, but what does life look like for Tamsyn Manou? I mean, other than just being the mother of 2 that you are, and husband to Graham Manou during, say March 2020. I mean, did your plans hugely shift last year? Was this all-out approach to say, hey, we've been planning for the Olympics and we're going to Tokyo, not so much as a family, but as a broadcasting team? Mm-hmm. I mean, what does March 2020 since then look like for you as a person?
Look, in March, I was meant to be going to the World Indoors to work on those championships, which were going to be held in China. And so I was going to be on field as the roving commentator, which is one of my favorite things to do, where you're out there trackside and you're commentating on live sport, and you're able to do the interviews live, and you're able to see the raw emotion live, and you're able to just interact straight off the feedback that the athletes are giving you right behind you. So I was really looking forward to that. Like a lot of people, the jobs that I had in place were just completely taken off the table. And so I guess there's one way to have looked at it and gone, oh my goodness, I've lost all my work for the year. But I was fortunate that it meant that I was able to spend a bit more time at home with the kids. And I've just looked at it in terms of, at least that's the positive of it. I've been home with the kids, and I've been able to help with homeschooling my daughter, which has been very strange and different, but that would have been tough if I wasn't around. And I guess even though
Good old Google Classroom, Tamsyn.
Oh dear. But even though I lost all of my income, I guess the only way we could look at it and still be functioning with a smile on your face was to say, well, at least Graham was still working. But it was tough. Graham and I, from the time that we met each other, we would never spend more than a week in the same house. And so all of a sudden we were together for like the whole year. So friends had bets on us lasting, but we managed to last, and that's the main thing. But it's been tough.
Yeah. And take us into that. I mean, obviously with the cricket side of things, the Centre of Excellence is up in Brisbane. Brisbane. How's he gone with that?
Oh, it's so tough because he's been in the front room just working off the computer, and nobody likes to do that. He's in a sport where his favorite part of it is the interaction that he gets with not only the players, the other people he works with, and just that interaction by going up to the performance center and the camps that he puts in place with the juniors coming through. A lot of them have fallen away because they haven't been able to go ahead, and that's been really tough. So a lot of the work you put in then doesn't come to fruition. So it's just one of those things where he's just waiting for it to start to open up again so that he can get back out there. But it's like, just like everyone, it's been tough.
Yeah. And Australia's best medal hopes in the track and field. I mean, obviously you've got Rowan Browning, Kelsey Lee Barber with the javelin, Morgan Mitchell. I found an interesting one here, and this is something that's a little bit left field. Saw a story on the news about it. Was Sinead Diver, a 44-year-old runner that's from Ireland, who's competing in the marathon. So she only took up the sport 11 years ago. I mean, who do we look for from a medal point of view? I know it's a tough ask to go out and say, hey, let's try and get a gold medal. And I know swimming's been a real dominant sport when it comes to Australia. Pretty much, 2000 Olympics in some ways. That we have an expectation in the pool. What about track and field? Can we see some potential hopes? I mean, I know, Commonwealth Games, we tend to have more medal winners because there's less countries competing. What about those four names? Do you expect a medal out of one of those?
Rowan Browning, if he could make the final, would be absolutely amazing. He's had a fantastic year. He broke 10 seconds with an illegal tailwind, which is just huge by an Australian. He ran 10:05 to get that Olympic qualifier, and it's looked brilliant. For him he can make that final. And so fingers crossed he does that. Morgan Mitchell, she'd just be praying that she makes the team at the moment. She's not in shape. She's been struggling all season with injury, and she's only just come back, and she's raced a couple of races in Queensland but has been getting beaten by the juniors, unfortunately, so she's not quite in shape, and I think she's going to run out of time. Kelsey Lee Barber, world champion, you would never discount her because the way she won that world championship gold on that last throw under pressure, she's got big potential, but it's going to be tough. We've also got Catherine Mitchell coming back, who won the Commonwealth Games gold in the javelin. So
she's from Western Victoria, she is.
Yes, she is, and she's absolutely fantastic. So we could have two girls in with a good chance in the javelin. Having said that, then you've got Sinead Diver as a marathoner. Her story is just amazing, and she's just such a lovely lady and mother of two. Could have represented Ireland, but we are like high-fiving the fact that she's competing for Australia because she's brilliant. And alongside her, you're going to have Ellie Pashley and Lisa Waitman going for her 4th Olympics. So the marathoners are going to be interesting, and anything can happen in the men's and women marathon. But I think our main medal chances, apart from Kelsey Lee, come in, we've got the pole vault. Nina Kennedy has been doing great things in Australia. She's broken the Australian record, and she's definitely in with a chance to get on that podium. Curtis Marshall, the male pole vaulter, he's also got a really good chance. I think Matt Denny threw over 66 meters on the weekend in the discus, and he was in the top 6 at the world champs in 2019. So you can't write him out. And Danny Stevens, our female discus thrower, she's won a world title in 2009, but this is her 4th Olympics as well. So she knows what she has to do, and she came 4th in Rio. So she was so close to that podium. Brooke Stratton, if she jumps 7:05 in the long jump pit, she's a chance. There's heaps of people that have a great chance. It's just about going out there and executing on the day, which is an incredibly hard thing to do. And in a world sport, which is truly global, it's pretty tough to get on that podium, but I think we do have chances, and we've got some really exciting athletes to watch. Well, another one in the women's 800 who you should have mentioned before Morgan is Katrina Bisset. She's our national champion, and she is fantastic. So I think she can make a final as well.
I tell you what, your homework's been paying off in lockdown, hasn't it?
Oh, do you know what? You just started talking athletics, and the Australian athletes I love. So Peter Bowle in the men's 800, he's running beautifully as well. So there's so many.
What's that been like though for you? Like you go into an Olympics and you're forced into lockdown, and I have been noticing it on your socials, is doing all that research and all that sort of stuff. I mean, is that making that transition not just from competing, but to go into that research aspect? I mean, it's just hours and hours. You can tell it's coming out. I mean, how have you found that during COVID?
I was a nerd at school, and I'm happy to admit that I was a nerd at school. I loved anything where I had to go home and do homework and open the books.
You did a science degree.
Yeah, I do. With athletics research, the thing I love the most is actually learning the backstory of all the athletes. And when you start to research a bit further than their stats, you start to find the human level and you start to find little things about them that I feel like it's my job and my responsibility to tell the audience and try and make them connect with that person so that they then go on the journey with them. I think, you know, a lot of our Australian track and field athletes, especially, they don't get a lot of publicity. And when the Olympics on, they're on mainstream TV and the media's watching and the average person's watching. And I feel like if I can tell something about them that brings their personality to life, maybe people will connect and follow their journey for the rest of their career. And I think a lot of our athletes really deserve that attention because they're just wonderful people and they've all got a great story to tell, not just on the athletics track.
Did you get a chance to do that when you were competing in terms of not just focusing on what you were doing, but understanding the backstory about some of the athletes that you're competing against? I mean, how was that? I mean, was it something that you took a fascination in, thinking, oh, well, this person's been out for such a long period, you know, they could have come back from a knee surgery or whatever, and you get to know, well, not just speaking to the athletes, but sort of hear through other people, you know, what their willpower's like, what their give's like and all that, because it is that human compassion in a lot of ways that comes out in the Olympics, particularly track and field. And we see that. And we see that particularly in the marathon events and that sort of thing. I mean, what is your feel about that, particularly if you go back to when you were competing? Did you get a chance to sort of study that, I suppose, the athlete, but also the backstory behind the athlete?
I guess I'm a little bit different to the average person because my parents both did the sport. So for me, I grew up loving sport. I loved Hawthorn Football Club. I loved watching the Olympic, you know, sport. I lived and breathed it. And for me, I had a lot of the old school people around me. Peter Norman used to train with my dad. You know, he won the medal in the 200 meters at the Olympics in 1968. And so I found myself knowing the history of our sport and loving the history side of our sport before I'd even started the sport. And for me, even as I went through, I was sort of a student of it. I loved to know who the competitors were, what everybody else was doing in other events. I didn't get as deep as I do now into all the events, but I did open my eyes and try and find out, you know, when you're on the circuit, if you're having breakfast, I used to have to room and eat with heaps of different people because there wasn't a lot of Australians on the circuit after the 2000 Olympics. And so if I hadn't gone out of my way to meet people, then I would have just sat there on my own. So yeah, it was fascinating meeting other people and hearing how they live their day-to-day life because their cultures are so different. And I think that's one of the best things that I took away from my career, because otherwise you'd be so self-involved and just be focusing on yourself the whole time. But track and field's a wonderful sport in the fact that it is global and you come together on that start line and you come from all different backgrounds. And if you take the opportunity to get to know them, you start to realize that even though you do have very different cultures, you've got the same goals and you find at the end, you're actually quite good friends.
And I have heard you on recent interviews talk about sort of winning gold medals at the Commonwealth Games or competing at the Olympics. It's on the biggest stage. Like, obviously, you're a young athlete, you're going into the Sydney 2000 Olympics and being in an early stage of that 2000 Olympics. Was one of the highlights from the Sydney 2000 Olympics, and you're obviously competing at two other Olympics, 04 and 08, was one of the highlights competing in that 4x100, you know, with you know, Kathy Freeman, Jana Pittman, you know, even Lauren Hewitt, who comes from Victoria as well. I mean, you know, you look back at that now and you think, oh, that 4x100, you know, the people who was calling the race as well. I mean, take us back into that sphere. I mean, I watched the video and I just thought, oh, you know, when you start off with the baton, I mean, is that, how does that rank now, like with the relay events, particularly from the Sydney Olympics?
Well, it was the 4x400. I wish I was fast enough to be in the 4x100. But the 4x4, yeah, no, when they told me I was starting that heat, I was like, what, you're starting with the 800 meter runner? But yeah, I don't think I appreciate it as much as I appreciate it now, the fact that I got to run alongside some of the best female athletes that our country ever had. You know, that final night we had Nova Paris, Melinda Gainsford-Taylor, Kathy Freeman, and I slot in there with those three big names. So it was a pretty big team to be a part of. We broke the Australian record, but it's probably one of my most disappointing races, to be honest, because I feel like we should have come away with a medal and we only just missed that podium. But having said that, I still really respect the fact that I was able to be a part of that team and you know, see the way they went about their athletics. And I think for me, I roomed with Kathy Freeman at those games, and she's my favorite athlete of all time because she's not only the best athlete I've ever seen compete, she's a beautiful mover, but she's just the most humble, down-to-earth human being you'll ever meet as well. So I didn't realize it at the time, but as a 21-year-old, 22-year-old at their first Olympics, to room with Kathy Freeman, yeah, that's probably one of the best things from those games.
Yeah, and it wasn't just those four names there. There was a bit of a squad, wasn't there, in that?
Huge squad.
Because I think I watched the I watched the trials and leading up to that final, and there were you had that interview with Paddy Walsh afterwards, and
yes,
said, oh, well, we don't,
our heat.
we don't have, we didn't, like, I know you had Nova in that race, but you didn't have Kathy in that race, for instance.
No.
And Yana was quite young. She was probably 18 at the time. So I just
ran amazing.
Yeah.
She ran amazing. And so we had Susan Andrews as well. And I think the hardest thing about that squad was the fact that you had 6 ladies that were talented enough to run in that final. So dropping the 2 out and bringing the other 2 in, that was even now, I think if you spoke to the relay coach, if you asked him if he chose the right team for the final, I'm not sure he'd say yes, he did, because it was a strong 6. I guess the only person who had earned their spot was Freeman. So the rest of us were just fighting to be in the team.
Yeah, and obviously even now you've got that I suppose IP, intellectual property, going into not just with your commentating, but you're also working head of athletics at Furbank Grammar School in Melbourne. Take us into that role. Is that a role that you've had obviously prior to COVID and then now into COVID? I mean, how do you sort of communicate with the up and coming runners, particularly at that particular prestigious grammar school, and how do you sort of communicate with the staff in the school?
Look, I never wanted to be a coach when I retired from athletics, but I actually got asked to meet with a guy called Peter Russo, Felix, his nickname was. He played for Hawthorn Football Club and he's head of sport at Furbank. And when I met with him, I was with my brother as well. And he said, we'd really love you to come along and be the coach of the athletics team. And I looked at him and I said, oh, I can't say no to you, because you were like one of my heroes as a kid. And so you're a 2-time premiership player for Hawthorn. I have to say yes. And that was in 2013. And I'm still there because I absolutely love being around him, and the way that he is with that school is he's phenomenal. The girls are fantastic. I feel a real sense of accomplishment when I teach them about fitness and health, and just about, you can all run and you can all keep fit and healthy. I think that's what I really love about being involved at that school. I think the girls really, they buy into the program, they buy into Run Club, they buy into the fact that it's more about enjoying your sport than it is about winning at school level. So I've loved my time at Furbank, and as long as Peter's there, I'm not going anywhere.
Well, that's good. That's good to hear. And obviously, that's great. I mean, obviously, when it sort of comes to your, situation, particularly now, I mean, you have lived in Queensland, and just talk us into or just quickly just touch on what was with the move back to Melbourne. Was it family related, or how did that come to being? I mean, was it a stint that you're living up in Queensland for? You're obviously presenting on the Great Day Out, I think it was.
Yeah, it was the Great Day Out, and then it turned into the Weekender. Yeah, which I love doing. It was a lifestyle program. When I first got the gig, I was like, lifestyle? Oh, I'm more into sport. But I loved it. I got to travel around Queensland and meet a lot of people, and it was a lot of good fun. The episode where I went wakeboarding and thought that I was good enough to go over the biggest jump in my second ever time around was probably not so good, not my finest moment. But no, I loved working in Queensland. I love the people, but I missed my family. When we moved up there, Ollie was less than 6 months old and Isabella was only 3. I just missed my mum and dad and my brother and my sister-in-law and nephews and niece. So I think when push came to shove, we got to choose where we lived, because obviously you could travel and there was a lot of travel involved. It was pretty hard to make the decision, but we decided to come back to Melbourne so we could be close to family. But we loved our time in Queensland, and who knows, we may go back at some point. But I'm a Melbourne girl through and through. I grew up in Melbourne and all my friends and family are here. So, moving back just felt like the right thing to do.
Yeah, and hopefully, as we come into the Olympics, that we can get athletics back on, the ground that it should be, and hopefully that, if we do get a medal, hope that it'll give the inspiration for the next generation to go out there and compete. Not just, we know that little athletics is well populated, but as we get into the teen years, because even females in sport, we've had world champion Ironmans on here, and their message is 15 plus. We want to make sure that girls stay in sport. That's really important as well. Interesting, Tamsyn. As I said, I like to do the park runs, and I played cricket this year, and I had a little bit of an injury the other week. I had a hairline fracture to the toe, so it's been a bit hard the last couple of weeks because I haven't been able to go out and do the 5K runs and all that sort of stuff. Tell me, what should I do? And what's the most, not so much the most embarrassing injury, what's the most odd injury you've had? And have you ever had a broken toe before?
I've actually got a broken toe. I think I've got something similar. So in 2008, I think I slammed my toe against a stair when I was doing fast steps in training. And I thought nothing of it. But the fracture must have never healed properly and calcified. And so it got really big on that knuckle. And pretty much it's been breaking and, calcifying ever since 2008. It's really painful. I can't wear stilettos anymore, but I think that's a good excuse not to put high heels on. And I'm guessing you probably don't wear high heels, so you're okay with that. But
if I did, I'm almost a Collingwood 6-footer, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, go for the platform if you do, because the stiletto's really sore on that toe. But it's one of those things where you have to protect it, because if you don't, it'll do what's happened to mine and it gets really painful. But I think you're better off just letting it heal before you do too much more, or just trying not to run too much on that toe. Just
swimming and having some therapeutic ocean sessions, just wading the foot in the ocean, just trying to let it heal, because then I found that the bruising started to come out, but it's just sore now, and having the prescribed medication from the doctor. But no, I really wanted to thank you for coming on the podcast. And like I said, I love the personality that you come out with. It's not
thanks.
just how infectious you are with your personality, but I think that even when you're competing, you could sense that, you could sense that you could build that, I suppose, camaraderie with people that you were competing with, and you never took yourself too seriously, although you tried your absolute best and you did exceptionally well on the world stage, and you're bringing it back to athletics now with what you've done. So I really wanted to thank you, and good luck for the Tokyo Olympics, and I hope you get to catch up with Bruce McAvaney. He's a doyen of commentary and someone that I've always looked up to, and really appreciate your time on the Stoned Heen View podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's been so fun talking sport.
I love it, Tamsyn, and you can check out the Stoned Heen View. We've got a business edition as well, but the Stoned Heen View podcast, this is our penultimate edition for the series 3, and we're going to actually have a guest next week that's returning, that has had a little bit to do with the program since its infancy. And you can check out the Stoned Heen View. We're on Facebook, on Instagram. Our podcast is available on Apple Podcasts. You can subscribe to the podcast through, obviously, Spotify. We'll be launching this on Podbean. And thanks for Tamsyn for doing the right thing by the kids. And then obviously doing that and making sure that we did do the program. So I appreciate you coming on early. And we've also got a YouTube channel, and at the Stoned Heen View is on Twitter at Stoned Heen View. So until next time, we're going to wrap up our Series 3 finale next week for episode 63. It's been a great delight to have Tamsyn Manou on. I always keep saying Lewis, but
it's okay.
She's been fantastic, and we'll see you soon on the Stoned Heen View.